The atmosphere was electric from the moment the cameras started rolling. Tensions were already brewing behind the scenes, and as the segment began, it became clear that the usual polished banter was about to be shattered. The conversation initially tried to stay on safe ground, but a few probing questions quickly steered the discussion into dangerous waters. There was an unmistakable shift in the energy on set, a mix of anticipation and dread, like standing at the edge of a brewing storm. From McKee, the moment the exchange began, it was clear neither side intended to back down. One side fired off rapid accusations, laced with sharp criticisms and thinly veiled jabs that sought to undermine credibility at every turn. It wasn't just disagreement, it was a full frontal assault, executed with the kind of smirking confidence that demands submission or retaliation. Instead of shrinking back, the response came fast and sharp, slicing through the tension with a brutal clarity that the hosts were clearly not prepared for. The verbal sparring escalated with every passing second. Attempts to control the discussion were completely overrun by a refusal to play by the usual daytime TV rules. There were no polished sound bites, no carefully crafted narratives, just raw, unfiltered pushback delivered in real time, each word punctuated by an intensity that crackled through the air and left even the studio audience visibly shifting in their seats. A few audience members gasped audibly. A few others could be seen shaking their heads in disbelief. Everyone could feel that the dynamic had changed. The usual deference given to the panel was gone, replaced by a no-holds-barred confrontation that demanded to be taken seriously. The host tried to steer the conversation back to safe, scripted territory, but the fire had already been lit. Efforts to redirect were steamrolled by blunt refusals to acknowledge the false premises being set. Every weak point in the argument was exposed methodically, calmly at first, but with an undeniable undercurrent of growing frustration. When interruptions began, a tactic clearly meant to rattle and regain control, they were met with an unflinching glare and firm, repeated demands to speak without being talked over. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't going to be business as usual, and no amount of shouting or smug laughter was going to change that. The moment that pushed the situation past the point of no return came when personal attacks entered the conversation. What started as a debate about ideas turned ugly when insinuations about character and motives were thrown like grenades across the table. At that point, any pretense of civility dissolved completely. What had been a heated argument exploded into open chaos. The energy in the room tightened into a knot of collective discomfort, and the audience, sensing the historic nature of the moment, fell silent, except for a few scattered murmurs. Without hesitation, a bold decision was made to end the chaos decisively. Words were exchanged with producers just off camera. The person causing the disruption was asked, firmly and publicly, to leave. No sugarcoating, no behind-the-scenes diplomacy. It happened live, unedited, in front of millions watching. At home, the disbelief on the faces of the remaining panelists said it all. They were caught completely off guard, their carefully maintained environment shattered beyond repair. As the person was escorted off set, there was a lingering tension in the air, a realization that the old rules had been thrown out the window. No longer could hosts or guests expect to wield narrative power without challenge. No longer would a glossy veneer be enough to shield weak arguments or bad faith attacks. The landscape had shifted right in front of everyone's eyes, and for a brief, electrifying moment, the usual power dynamics of television had been flipped completely upside down. There was no celebratory applause, no triumphant victory lap. Just a raw, almost stunned silence as the program struggled to move forward, visibly rattled by the sheer intensity of what had just unfolded. The message had been sent loud and clear without the need for further words. Respect isn't demanded by position. It's earned through strength, principle, and the refusal to be cowed, even under the bright lights and massive pressure of live national television. Chaos on live television is rare, but when it happens, it sends shockwaves that ripple far beyond the studio walls. As the confrontation escalated, it became obvious that this wasn't going to be a typical on-air disagreement. The atmosphere grew heavier with each exchange, and the audience, usually accustomed to the lively but controlled environment, could sense the moment spiraling out of the host's grasp. Panelists attempted to regain composure and assert control, but the rapid-fire confrontation made it impossible to reset the tone. Each interruption, each raised voice, added to the combustible energy building steadily toward an inevitable explosion. For a few excruciating minutes, producers hesitated, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the fireworks play out. The stakes were high. Viewers at home expect polish and professionalism. What they got instead was raw, live conflict, broadcast without a filter. Behind the scenes, there were urgent conversations through earpieces and frantic hand signals just off camera. The host tried to press forward, but the room had changed. Control had been lost, and with it, the illusion of smooth, safe television was slipping further away with every second. At the height of the verbal clash, when it became clear that there would be no return to civility, a decision was made, and it was both swift and shocking. Security staff, usually invisible in the polished world of daytime talk shows, stepped onto the stage. The audience gasped. No one expected a scene like this, especially not on a show that built its reputation on spirited but contained debate. The very idea of someone being asked to leave in front of millions of live viewers was unthinkable. Yet here it was, unfolding in real time. The tension cracked as the producers made it official. An announcement was made, firm but professional, stating that order had to be restored for the sake of the show and its audience. It wasn't a request, it was a directive. The person at the center of the storm reacted with disbelief at first, challenging the decision, refusing to move immediately, trying to salvage dignity in a situation that had already spiraled beyond repair. But the cameras, still rolling, captured everything: the frustration, the stunned expressions from the panelists, the audience frozen in their seats, some covering their mouths in shock. As the individual was escorted off the stage, there was no triumphant music, no quick cutaway to soften the blow. It was raw and awkward, the kind of moment that television producers have nightmares about, and viewers talk about for days. What made it even more surreal was the realization that this wasn't some anonymous guest or background figure. It was a prominent participant in the discussion, a figure accustomed to commanding attention, now walking off under the bright lights for all the wrong reasons. The other panelists sat rigidly in their chairs, some struggling to hide their discomfort, others failing entirely. A few made awkward attempts to transition the conversation to a new topic, but the damage was done. The incident had fractured the show's carefully cultivated image, and no amount of smiling or forced laughter could stitch it back together immediately. The energy of the room had shifted irrevocably. Every word that followed felt hollow, every attempt to regain normalcy transparent to the audience, still reeling from what they had just witnessed. In the wake of the removal, there was an undeniable air of embarrassment hanging over the studio. The staff moved quickly, adjusting cameras, whispering instructions, trying to salvage the broadcast, but nothing could erase the collective memory of what had just taken place. It wasn't just a dramatic moment, it was a cultural shift captured on live TV. It sent a message to every guest who might think they could dominate the conversation through volume or disruption alone. It re-established a boundary that many thought had been eroded beyond recovery. For the audience watching from home, it was a stark reminder that not everything can be spun or controlled. Sometimes reality intrudes into the safe, manufactured world of television, and when it does, it leaves an indelible mark. People who tuned in expecting casual conversation and sanitized disagreements were instead witnesses to a historic moment of accountability. No edits, no filters, just pure, unscripted consequences in front of The studio audience came in expecting a lively discussion, perhaps a few spicy comments or debates that would eventually resolve into the usual friendly banter. What they got instead was something entirely different. As the argument on stage spiraled, further out of control, the energy in the room changed so dramatically that it felt almost physical, like the sudden drop in pressure before a storm hits. Conversations that had started as playful sparring had escalated into direct confrontation, and the audience could feel every ounce of rising tension crackling through the air. As the clash intensified, the audience's reactions shifted from polite laughter and applause to stunned silence. People sitting in the first few rows exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to look at the stage or each other. Some clutched their seats a little tighter. Others instinctively leaned forward, pulled in by the sheer gravity of the moment. It was as if everyone collectively realized that the script had been thrown out the window, and they were witnessing something unplanned, unfiltered, and utterly real. When security was called onto the set and the call to remove the disruptive guest was made, the collective intake of breath was nearly audible. For a few long seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The normally chatty, responsive audience was frozen in place, caught between disbelief and curiosity. A handful of people raised their phones, unsure whether it was appropriate to capture what was happening. Most simply stared, mouths slightly open, as reality unfolded in a way no one could have anticipated. The awkwardness on stage spilled directly into the crowd. There were no clean breaks, no commercial cuts to protect the sensibilities of the people watching live. What they saw was raw emotion, confusion, even a flash of anger. As the figure was led away, a few isolated claps could be heard, not out of celebration, but out of sheer nervous instinct, as if someone thought maybe clapping would somehow restore normalcy. It didn't. The ripple of uncertain applause quickly died out, leaving behind a heavy, uncomfortable silence. People sitting farther back in the studio craned their necks to get a better look. Some whispered to each other in hushed tones, others simply sat back in their chairs, stunned. The hosts at the table, usually so adept at maintaining the pace of the show, seemed momentarily paralyzed, unsure whether to address what had just happened or pretend it hadn't. That uncertainty only deepened the audience's unease. Without the usual cues, the smiles, the smooth transitions, the jokes, the crowd was left to sit in the reality of what they had just witnessed. The floor. Production team scrambled behind the scenes and it showed. Lights flickered slightly as cameras adjusted, stage hands moved quickly but quietly along the edges of the set, and someone in the back could be heard giving muffled instructions. Yet for all the technical efforts to resume normal operations, there was no easy way to erase the shock that had taken hold. The audience had been part of something far larger than a simple talk show segment. They had been witnesses to a raw, unscripted moment of conflict and consequence. Many in the audience wore the kind of expressions usually reserved for unexpected public incidents. A mix of embarrassment for the people involved, discomfort at their own proximity to it, and fascination at the sheer unpredictability of it all. Some avoided eye contact with the stage entirely, while others could not tear their eyes away. It was clear that no one knew how to react. Should they applaud the restoration of order? Should they express disapproval? Should they just sit silently and hope the show regained its footing? The usual unspoken social rules of studio audiences didn't seem to apply anymore. For the remaining duration of the broadcast, a noticeable tension lingered. Even as the hosts tried to soldier on, their words carried a stiffness that betrayed their unease. Smiles seemed a little too forced, laughter a little too brittle. And the audience, usually quick to respond to even the lightest jokes or comments, was hesitant, responding more out of habit than genuine engagement. It was the kind of disruption that couldn't simply be smoothed over with a clever line or a planned segue. The audience knew what they had seen, and no amount of polish could unsee it. In a world where polished performances often take priority over genuine dialogue, the decision to stand firm in the face of chaos sent a shockwave that went far beyond the television studio. What unfolded was not just a defense of personal dignity, but a clear, resounding rejection of the performative hostility that has become so common in public discourse. Instead of bending to the pressure, instead of trying to placate or smooth things over for the sake of keeping appearances, the choice was made to push back, not with anger, not with insults, but with a resolute demand for respect and real conversation. The refusal to yield to staged provocation sent a loud message that civility is not about staying silent in the face of disrespect. It is about drawing a clear line and refusing to let noise drown out substance. Too often, environments like that talk show thrive on conflict as entertainment, crafting moments of staged outrage to boost ratings and fuel online clicks. But there was nothing staged about this. This was a moment of real human resistance against manipulation, a refusal to be boxed into a narrative written by others. By standing firm, it became clear that certain principles are non-negotiable. Respect, honesty, and the right to speak without being shouted down are not privileges to be granted or withheld based on popularity or political convenience. They are fundamental to any meaningful discussion. And when those principles were trampled on, there was no hesitation in pushing back hard enough to shake the very foundation of the show's carefully maintained image. It was not about showmanship. It was about refusing to play a role in a scripted drama designed to humiliate and distort. The decision to act rather than passively endure the escalating chaos wasn't made lightly. There were undoubtedly 1,000 calculations racing through the minds of those involved. The fear of how the media would spin it. The pressure to conform to the polite dishonesty that often dominates televised discussions. The risk of being portrayed as unreasonable simply for refusing to accept bad faith attacks. But none of that mattered in the moment when core values were on the line. The choice was made to prioritize integrity over image, and in doing so, a powerful example was set for everyone watching. It showed that debate should never be about who can shout the loudest or who can deliver the most cutting insult. Debate should be about ideas clashing in the pursuit of truth, not personalities colliding in the pursuit of cheap entertainment. By holding the ground with calm, firm resolve, a standard was reestablished. A standard that too many have forgotten or abandoned in the quest for viral moments and social media applause. The message was unmistakable. There will be no surrender. To the circus. Even as the fallout from the confrontation continued to unfold, with viewers and pundits scrambling to process what they had just seen, the real impact had already been made. It was a reminder that strength doesn't always look like shouting louder or fighting dirtier. Sometimes true strength is the refusal to be baited into a battle of egos. Sometimes true strength is staying composed while setting boundaries that are non-negotiable. The silence that followed the removal was not just a pause in the conversation. It was an acknowledgement, even from critics, that something unusual had happened. In a place where volume often wins and truth often takes a back seat, someone had demanded better and done it without descending into the mud. There was no grandstanding, no attempt to turn the moment into a personal victory lap. There was only a simple, unshakable insistence that if real dialogue was going to happen, it would happen on a foundation of mutual respect, not manufactured outrage. By standing firm, the moment created an invisible but lasting ripple. It challenged the comfortable assumptions of what televised debate could be. It forced both the audience and the hosts to confront the uncomfortable reality that not every confrontation can be tamed by laughing it off or moving to the next segment. Some confrontations reveal deeper truths about the quality of our discourse, about the courage it takes to stand up for real dialogue, and about the price that sometimes comes with refusing to play along with a rigged game. What unfolded in that studio was more than a confrontation between two opposing voices. It was a mirror held up to a much deeper cultural fracture. For too long, platforms built on the promise of dialogue have strayed into theater, rewarding those who shout the loudest rather than those who dare to speak the truth. In that moment, the facade cracked, and the audience, whether they realized it immediately or not, witnessed something rare, a stand for substance over spectacle. The decision to resist being drowned out was not about ego, nor about winning an argument for applause. It was about refusing to allow a manufactured narrative to dictate reality. It was about showing that true conversation demands a willingness to listen, not just to attack. When the environment became toxic, when disrespect replaced dialogue, action was taken, swift, clear, and necessary, to protect the space where real ideas could still matter. It would have been easy to do what so many do on these platforms: smile, nod, laugh off the cheap shots, and move on without challenging the deeper disrespect beneath the surface. That would have been easier for the audience to digest, easier for the media to package neatly, easier for everyone involved to pretend that real communication had taken place. But that isn't how change happens. Change demands discomfort. It demands moments where the illusions are shattered and people are forced to confront the reality beneath the show. The stunned silence of the audience wasn't just a reaction to an unexpected turn of events. It was the recognition, perhaps subconscious, that they had just seen someone refuse to play a rigged game. And in that refusal, they saw a glimpse of something that has become increasingly rare: courage without theatrics, principle without compromise. Moments like this are messy. They don't fit neatly into the sound bites and headlines that will inevitably follow, but their power lies precisely in that messiness. They remind us that not every clash needs to be packaged for easy consumption. Some moments are meant to be uncomfortable because they reveal the gaps between what we pretend dialogue is and what real dialogue demands. In the end, what happened was not just a disruption. It was a reassertion of standards, a bold declaration that shouting matches are no substitute for debate, that character assassination is no substitute for argument, and that respect is not something to be negotiated depending on who is sitting across the table. It was a reminder that real conversations, the ones that matter, can only happen when people refuse to surrender the ground of honesty and principle, even when the cost is high and the light